right, everyone, try to come in and get settled. We're going to get started with the last session before lunch, but one that I'm particularly excited to be a part of and listen in here on. We're going to be talking with Zalando today about data mesh in practice. So take it away.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be here in person again today again. It's been over 2 years since I took the last time a stage at a conference, and it's just amazing. Come in here, see, and also hear the chit-chat of hundreds of people. I'm really amazed, and I want to thank you all for attending here today, but also, of course, for the organizers for making this possible. One of the most amazing things that I love about being live at conferences is that you actually get the opportunity to ask questions to people. So let me first start with a very simple question. Whom of you has heard about the data mesh before entering this room? That is great. That's already the majority. Whom of you has already had a bit deeper look and knows what are the core pillars of the data mesh paradigm? Okay, that's much less. I will cover that for sure in the talk. And last but not least, whom of you has just been in the other room and listened to the data mesh conversation and presentation from Scania before? That's almost the same group that just raised their hands before. So now I know where your knowledge is coming from on that side. All right, before we get started, just a short introduction about myself. Who am I? I'm Max. I am currently a data engineering manager at Zalando. I am leading the team that is responsible for the storage layer of our former and still data lake at the company that is in the process of a huge transformation at the moment. And as part of that, I've been working on distributed storage, distributed compute, tools and services around that for many, many years now. And of course, I've seen a lot of the pain points that came along with that, especially with central setups, like a centralized data lake. And eventually, I realized that this is a good opportunity, and this fits very well with what has been discussed more and more from the data mesh side. And I realized that a lot of things that the people came up with from the data mesh perspective are things that we were already starting to do ourselves. So I got in touch there. I started going very deep in the topic, and I started becoming a bit of a data mesh advocate as well, with O'Reilly trainings and some books that I'm currently working on as well. Personally, I'm a huge gamer, and the last time, in fact, that I've been to Stockholm was for a Magic the Gathering card game tournament a couple of years ago. So if you ever, at any point later on, you also want to chat about gaming, I'll be your man there as well. What I have prepared for you today is actually a bit of a journey through how data mesh started, but also how to actually apply some of these things in practice, because I think that's what most of you are here for as well. So I want to give you a brief glimpse at how data analytics is looking today at most of the big companies. I want to give this short introduction about the data mesh as well, and I want to take you on a journey of what are the things that you really can do to make these things practical. Starting with the data analytics today, or how I love to call it, the oversimplified history of data analytics, there has basically been two major paradigms that have been stuck around for the last couple decades, I would say. And the first one of that is the data warehouse. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows what its purpose is for. It's mostly used for analytical reporting. It's mostly used for BI use cases. And it's somewhat simple in how it is structured, as you directly take data from many, many different sources, and you put a lot of effort into preparing the data and into providing quality data when loading the data into your data warehouse. Interestingly, this has a couple drawbacks as well, because on the one hand side, it's very tough to actually do this on a scaling approach where you have more and more and more data that you want to integrate with, and especially when it comes to the amounts of data that you want to store. And that is, of course, where there has been some technology shifts over the last I would say 2 decades, especially with the introduction of the cloud, with the massive introduction of object stores, of distributed processing, where the data lake became the much more predominant solution to actually address this, where we basically have infinite storage, where we can just get all the data in that we want to have. And that's also where we saw some of the ways of how we are dealing with data have changed, because now the ingestion barrier for getting the data in is much lower. So we are just storing everything there, and we then put in the effort afterwards to actually make sense of the data and prepare it accordingly. Now, interestingly, looking at this from quite a far distance away, those two approaches are actually not that different, because to some extent, there is certain data that resides in some sources that you get into a central storage system, and then you have a lot of consumers that actually access the data from there. And this leads to a couple of major deficits that have been discovered over, I would say the last 2 years, and have been like really actively discussed as part of the data mesh paradigm. The first one is the disconnection between producers and consumers. Like, you really have a problem that with the central storage, you have an infrastructure team in the middle that is responsible for maintaining the systems and the data within it, but the people actually consuming the data, they only know this infrastructure team, and they have no direct connection anymore to the people that actually produce this data. So you're ending up with a lot of unclear data ownership and unclear data responsibility. And this is really not scaling well. Because on the one hand side, you have an ever-growing amount of producers, but you also have an ever-growing amount of consumers that actually want to make use of this data. And this is incredibly hard because your infrastructure team cannot indefinitely scale, because there are just simply organizational limits and also limits in terms of money that the companies are willing to put in there. And especially when you look at things like quality control, it really doesn't scale well. Because either you slow down everyone by forcing some quality standards on them, or the quality simply goes down. That being said, data mesh is the savior of all of that. No, of course it is not, but it's one approach to actually think about these things, and this is exactly what I want to address now. So let me quickly share what is data mesh actually. Data mesh is consisting of 4 major pillars, and these are the key parts that I will now be introducing one by one. The first one being product thinking for data, followed by domain-driven design applied to distributed data, platform thinking for data infrastructure, and lastly, federated governance. So starting off with data as a product. We are all more or less like working in IT companies, and we are more or less familiar with product thinking when it comes to services, when it comes to applications, when it comes to things that we offer on the IT side, more from a technical perspective. But often, and for many, many years, data that is produced by these applications has always been a byproduct. It has never been the core focus of what we are actually doing with that. And this is exactly what we want to change here. We want to make sure that we actually see data as the product. We want to make sure that it gets the attention that it deserves, that we want to understand what is actually the market for the data. We want to understand who are the customers and what do they actually need and what do they actually want. Are they happy with what I'm providing them? And also, to some extent, what price, quote unquote, is justified when it comes to putting additional effort in increasing the quality of the data that I'm providing here. The second big part is we want to make sure that those people that know the most about the data are also the ones that actually take on the responsibility for providing it and for taking care of the quality and for taking care of all the things around that make the end users of this data happy in the end. And those are usually the people that sit within the respective domains. Previously, with the central setup, with the data warehouses and data lakes, this was always a cross-domain cutting problem that we had, because the domain doesn't end when the data is just thrown over the fence somewhere, but it goes much, much further, and we want to have the people, again, take end-to-end responsibility about the data, and we want to have the domain experts be the ones that actually take the ownership for the data that they are producing. The third part, and that is also where my personal experience is actually the deepest, is on the part of the data infrastructure platform. And this is exactly the part where many companies are coming from, already having central platform teams, already having teams that provide infrastructure, that provide services, but in many, many cases focused around data-specific use cases. But this is exactly the part that we want to change. We want to make sure that the infrastructure that is provided stays data agnostic. We want to make sure that there are certain things that are provided to everyone in the company independently from their use cases. And of course, considering the previous point that they are now the ones that actually take the end-to-end ownership for the actual data that they are providing, it also makes much more sense and is much more easier to put in place. Because now the infrastructure team is freed up to actually work on the specific features that bring the most value to the company as a whole and not just to some very specific use cases. And this comes in with certain features like discoverability. I want to offer a capability that allows the owners to actually make their data sets properly visible. I want to have the data addressable so that I can actually get to that. The data needs to be self-describing, which is again a combination of the people putting in the necessary information, but also providing the platform capability to actually ease that journey. The data needs to be secure, the data needs to be trustworthy, and last but not least, the data needs to be interoperable. And to address exactly that part, I'm jumping to the last big pillar, which is federated governance. Just before in the talk on the Scania side, there was actually a very interesting thing that was mentioned where they set up a group of product managers that were meeting on a regular basis to understand what are the common areas that they need to talk about, what are the things that they have in common that need to be discussed, that are overlaps between the different domains, so that they can bring together these ideas and make sure that we have that they find a common solution for that they are not blocking each other and starting to create silos that are drifting off into different directions. But this is only one part of the journey. Yes, I want to make sure that we bring together the data product owners from the respective domains. I want to make sure that we also bring in the data platform product owners to identify what are the key pain points in the respective domains and what are the things that we really can solve from a platform perspective instead of having every single team go through that by themselves. And of course, I also want to bring in strategic decision makers so that we can make sure that the company as a whole is still moving into the same direction. And again, as I just mentioned, to not have single domains that are drifting off entirely into different directions. One of the most important things about federated governance, though, is to not just focus on all the things that need to be aligned and that need to be standardized, but also to make sure that local decisions can be taken within the domain context wherever possible. So that wherever a certain decision is only affecting the context and the boundary of a certain domain, that the respective people in the domain are enabled to take this decision by themselves without the need to, again, align with everyone and slowing down the whole company. Because that's the only way how we can really, again, approach an agile and also an iterative process when working with data. So just to quickly summarize, data mesh is product thinking for data, domain-driven design applied to distributed data, platform thinking for data infrastructure, and federated governance. But most importantly, data mesh is a mindset shift. Because fundamentally, what data mesh is trying to address is to ask us to make conscious decisions on how we are dealing with data. We are changing the approaches. We are changing how we look at data and how we want to make sure that data gets the focus that it deserves so that we can get the biggest value out of it. Also very important to mention, data mesh is not a detailed framework or solution to be implemented. There's many technologies out there that can actually help you on the journey once you have identified what are the specific capabilities that you actually need. But most importantly, data mesh needs to get into the heads of the people first so that we can change the way on how we're thinking about data before we think about the explicit implementation patterns that we want to follow up on. Now let me take all this and let me draw this into a journey. And this is the part where I want to also be a bit more practical, and I want to split this down into 3 different parts. The first one, how can I actually get started? What are the first steps that I can take to actually get towards a data mesh? Second, how can I actually scale this once I have laid the foundation? And then last but not least, how can I achieve organizational alignment and reach exactly these points that I just mentioned on the side of federated governance? Getting started, I want to share a small story about pain points of unclear data ownership. I have experienced a story before where there was a new analyst that was starting in a team that was responsible for setting up a couple KPIs for the team. And previously, this team was always able to run all the KPIs that they had set up on the data that they were producing by themselves. But for the first time, they were now in the situation that they needed to also get additional data from another team, from another service, to incorporate to actually move forward with their KPI tracking. This person got a contact from another team, reached out to that team, took them a week to actually get a response, just to learn that they are not responsible for this. Took them another week to get a second response to learn that they don't even have any idea about this on whom to contact here in the first place. They were stuck. They talked to their local BI team. They found out that there's a central data lake team, so they started talking to them. They figured out that there was actually a data set that was helping them out and that was actually fulfilling their purpose here. And digging deeper together with the engineers from the data lake team, they realized that the owning team of that data that was originally producing it was, of course, the very first team that they already talked to. Now, reaching out to that team again, the team then also being a bit doubtful about their previous answers, started to dig deeper and only to realize that indeed there was a service that they were still maintaining that was producing this data. But the only person that knew about that specific service just left the company. And with them, the knowledge got lost. Of course, this is only one of many examples, but this feels incredibly real. This is something that is really like every one of us could imagine having something like this happen in their own company and organization as well. So, but what can we learn from that? The most important part is when we actually want to start moving towards a product-centric mindset, we need to understand the different perspectives. And just as given in our example, of course, there can be many follow-up actions. The usual reaction that is purely human would be to just steam off about that team that did all these bad things and they weren't even able to take care of their own services. But where does that get you? Actually, what you would rather want to do is to actually try to understand each other's perspectives. Because they didn't do that on purpose. They didn't do that of malintent because they didn't like us and they wanted to harm our product. That's absolutely not the case. Rather the opposite. They have a completely packed roadmap as well, same as we do. And they even lost a developer that was supposed to actually contribute to that roadmap, which put them even more under pressure. If at all, you would rather actually want to turn this around and you want to create incentives for them to actually start fixing this and start working towards a collaborative approach moving forward into the future. And that is actually the second part that you want to do, which is creating incentives. And incentives can be of two different kinds. One incentive that can be created and that is incredibly valuable is awareness. Mention the people that you depend on. If the next time you announce a new feature to one of your stakeholders, mention this one team that is an upstream dependency, because without their data, you would actually not be able to do your job. And yes, there was in this particular example a pretty difficult start to the whole journey. Yet still, without them, we wouldn't be able to do that. But if they now put in some additional effort to fix the situation and to address this, and if I'm then mentioning that to also the stakeholders, they actually realize that what they did, the effort that they put in, was worth it. So they feel motivated to actually go much further and double down on the collaboration that just has started. The other big part of our creating incentives is, of course, monetary. And this goes into two directions again. Either you have a system where, let's say, and that's usually present in bigger corporations as well, single people can be awarded by, let's say, reaching the next step in their career by participating in innovative projects and by participating in collaborative projects. And this would be like the first thing that you can, of course, incentivize by creating company-wide initiatives that allow people to push in that direction. On the other side, you can also monetarily incentivize teams by, let's say, giving them money to hire a new engineer that is actually taking care of these things. And specifically when, as the consuming team, you understand how much value you would be gaining by certain improvements in the service that you are relying on, it becomes a very easy pitch where you can say, hey, look, with this improvement, I would be gaining 1 million over a year. Can you hire another person that actually could take care of this? And all of a sudden, it becomes much easier to in a collaborative way, also speak with your management and get ahead on that side. Last but not least, start small. This is super important when you want to start rolling out a data mesh approach, where first the things need to go into the heads of the people. You cannot start with something that is pushed top down onto the whole organization and essentially forced onto the people. That will really not work. But instead, you much rather want to find a certain project team, maybe some folks that are already like a bit more innovative and have like a stronger spirit to start moving into new directions as well, and work together with them. Don't do just a small POC that doesn't add any value in the end, but also don't start with your business critical process that everybody is relying on. They need to have the possibility to make mistakes by themselves, but they also need to be able to prove some value afterwards, because that is actually what you want to start with. When it comes to scaling the mesh, there's a couple of things that I have already mentioned before. So first of all, there were like all these problems that we saw before, was falling into the responsibility, falling into the trap of taking centralized responsibility about data. And this is exactly the part where we again gain no explicit ownership, no data quality guarantees, and where the central team is becoming the bottleneck. Where instead, you actually want to rather provide a data infrastructure platform where you're handling the use cases in a data agnostic, self-service way, and where you're providing standardization of tooling throughout the audience, throughout the consumers and customers within your company, so that they can do their job in the most easiest and most sufficient way. The last point that I want to quickly address is on the organizational alignment. Again, I have already mentioned parts of that from the federated governance discussion. We can have two perfectly built data products that are running into totally different directions, that are completely isolated from each other, where it's incredibly hard to combine them together again and to be able to work with them in a single and central way. So we have unaligned data products, we have missing interoperability, and we are again creating data silos, even if within each silo we might have the perfect data products to boot along with. But instead, we want to be bringing the representatives of all the groups to the table. We want to then achieve the two different parts that I already mentioned before. We want to make sure that domain internal concerns are localized, that the decisions can be taken within the respective domain, but at the same time that we reach standardization of global processes for the things that concern all domains at the same time. Just to quickly summarize, for the getting starting part, I think it's incredibly important to foster empathy, to create incentives, and to start small. Once you reach the point that you have a couple teams and you want to be scaling the approach, you need a self-service data agnostic infrastructure platform. And lastly, when it comes to the point of organizational alignment, you need to bring local and global incentives together, but you need to enable decentral decision-making while also creating interoperability through global standardization. Thank you so much for your attendance.
That was an intense and information-packed presentation. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. We have a question in the chat, but I'd like to open up now quickly for questions. We have a couple of minutes. Is there anybody that wants to go first? All right. I thought it was pretty clear to me too, but there was a question in the chat that I think is interesting, which is, this asks a lot of an organization. What are indicators of an organization that is mature enough to start working in this way?
So the interesting part is that, as I mentioned a couple of times, the fundamental part that we are trying to address as the very first part is how we think about data. And that cannot start early enough. Sure, if you're working in a 10-people startup where everybody's doing everything and like there's no clear structures and you don't need to think about how to scale about like dozens of teams at the very start, and you rather want to be quick than thinking about organizational alignment. But if you are in a grown organization, I can only say you cannot start early enough to at least think about and make conscious decisions of how you're dealing with data.
So becoming mature is part of the journey.
Exactly.
Excellent. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining, and for everybody online, we will be back at 1:30 with an exciting talk from Soda. See you around.
One small closing remark. If you want to follow up, there will be O'Reilly trainings on the topic. The first one will be next one will be happening on 4th of November. Feel free to join that. And just as a small remark, we are also looking for data engineers for our team.
Thank you again.